Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and today we'll be discussing something I've wanted to address for a while now.
Godzilla Kong: The New Empire was the second surprise hit of the year 2024, the first being Dune Part 2. After a slew of pseudo-intellectual think pieces declaring the movie's inevitable failure, it not only succeeded, but it also became the highest-grossing monsterverse movie up to that point, as well as one of the highest-grossing movies of 2024. Part of that, admittedly, was thanks to it being released hot on the heels of Godzilla -1, which was a surprise hit unto itself. However, there was another side to the movie's success that doesn't get spoken about that much, or when it does, it's in a derogatory manner.
You see, Godzilla x Kong isn't really about anything. Not that that's a secret, practically everybody has brought it up at some point. However, that fact is usually offered as a point of criticism.
Detractors say that the movie's lack of substance renders it little more than mindless spectacle, a bunch of flashy lights and loud noises comprising a hollow shell, and especially when compared to -1, this hollowness is counted as a point against it.
Well, I stand before you today to say that this point is in fact accurate, but the paradigm is all wrong. It's true that the new empire has nothing really profound to say, which makes it entertainment for its own sake, but that's not a bad thing. In order to demonstrate that point, though, we need to establish a few things first.
The mantra that has dominated media discourse for years now is that all art is political, whether subtly or overtly. This, of course, is predominantly touted by people who themselves view everything from a political perspective and thus see no other way that something can exist.
Now, I don't believe this statement is true at all, but I also love when it's invoked because it's an absolutism. When people say all art is political, they mean all art, without exception, has some sort of a political bend to it. And the beauty of an absolutism is that it can be disproven with one counterexample. All you have to do is show one thing that runs contrary to the statement, and that statement has been proven a lie because there is no room for exceptions. So, if all art is political, we should not be able to find any examples of art that are not political. I could do this myself, but, Snazzy, you want to take the reins for a bit? I'd love to, Omni. Let's show people what real media literacy looks like.
Phil Collins' biggest hit song has got to be In the Air Tonight from the album Face Value. Not only is it a great piece of music on its own, but it's had people speculating for decades about what it means. The lyrics are esoteric in nature, which makes them difficult to figure out, but the hints of narrative make it seem like they must be about something.
Speculation got so intense, in fact, that it resulted in conspiracy theories.
Some say that Collins was recounting a murder he had witnessed, either as a child or more recently, and that he exposed the murderer the first time he performed the song live. Others suspected that it was a different sort of traumatic event from Collins' childhood, maybe a deep regret over failing to help a friend who was drowning, or that he himself nearly drowned at some point.
In an episode of Classic Albums devoted to Face Value, Phil Collins finally revealed the truth. In the Air Tonight is about nothing in particular.
As he tells it, he came up with the dark melody of the music first, then decided that moody music needs moody lyrics. Since he had a penchant for writing narrative songs, that's how the lyrics turned out, but they were not referring to anything that really happened.
Essentially, In the Air Tonight is atmosphere for its own sake, with nothing deeper to say. Ergo, if it has nothing to say, then by default, it's not political.
These are the sunflower paintings by Vincent van Gogh. Pretty, right? And that's all they are, a collection of pretty sunflower paintings.
Some of them were painted as gifts for his friend and fellow artist Pierre Gauguin, but the flowers don't represent anything deeper the way other Van Gogh paintings do.
He simply wanted to capture their beauty in his own distinct style. They're lovely pieces of art, but they're clearly not political.
Plenty of classic cartoons from the golden age of Hollywood were made just to be funny, but the inception of one in particular is very well documented. That being the Looney Tunes short, Bully for Bugs.
That's the one where Bugs Bunny ends up in a matador ring with an angry bull. So, is this one about animal rights? A commentary on Spanish culture? Perhaps a look at American tourist behavior? Actually, it's none of the above.
As told by Chuck Jones, the cartoon took shape when one of the producers, one specifically known for lacking a sense of humor, marched into Termite Terrace and apropos of nothing declared that bullfights were not funny.
This told Jones and his crew that they must be hilarious, so they set about seeing how many jokes they could milk out of the concept.
That's it. Just cartoonists finding humor in a scenario they were told was humorless. Needless to say, it's obviously not political.
One of the first video games ever made was Pong, a digital simulation of ping pong, which is itself a miniature simulation of tennis. The whole point is to simply use a paddle to hit the ball back and forth and score points. That's the very definition of being apolitical, and since video games count as art, well, isn't it obvious?
Shall I go on, Omni, or do you think the point's been made? You can stop there, we only needed the one after all, but now we have several examples which prove that not all art is political. In fact, we can even take this idea a step further and say that there are pieces of art with thematic elements to them, but those thematic elements are not always political either.
Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is predominantly about scientific ethics. Now yes, governments have been known to fund major scientific endeavors, but the fact is that science can be done by anybody with the drive and the resources. Victor Frankenstein is not funded by any political benefactor. He performs his ungodly experiments on his own, which means he could be any one of us. The ideas of overstepping one's boundaries or playing God can apply to any number of scenarios, and thus they are not specifically political in nature. Meanwhile, the many adventures of the Shadow in pulps, radio, and comics are predominantly morality tales, warning people against committing crime and giving in to evil urges lest they suffer the consequences. These tales only occasionally circle around to politics, but they usually remain on a grounded level with individuals who are more often motivated by their own selfish desires. There are themes, but not specifically political ones every time.
And what would you say to the popular counter-argument? You know, that choosing to be apolitical is still a political act. I'd say the argument is flawed at its very core. Saying that choosing not to be political is still a political act sounds like a statement, but it's actually an assumption.
It assumes that everybody views the world through a political paradigm, and thus something cannot be apolitical unless one consciously chooses to eschew the topic, and that choice must still be motivated by politics in some way.
Utter nonsense. The fact is that most people in the world don't constantly think about things in terms of politics. I certainly don't.
I didn't sit down to write any of my stories with the intention of being political or the intention of being deliberately apolitical. I just start off motivated to tell a good story, and if a theme of some sort will work to that end, then I include it. But if no theme arises and the story still works, then no theme was needed.
Okay, I think the point has been made. Not all art is political. Some art can exist without any sort of theme at all and just be art for its own sake. That is what we call escapism, and that's a wonderful kind of art. Godzilla Kong the New Empire is an example of escapism at its very core. It doesn't really have anything political to say. Not that people haven't tried to make it political. Perhaps we need to establish one more thing before we get to the real meat of the video. But in order to establish it, I must first ask, do you remember the Gorgo video I made early in this channel's history?
In it, I said that Gorgo could be viewed as having themes of feminism in it, but I also said by the end that these themes were likely accidental. After all, I'd never found anyone prior to my video interpreting Gorgo in that way, so in all likelihood, being feminist was not the intention.
I bring this up to demonstrate that sometimes a theme can exist by accident. Gorgo can be interpreted as a feminist movie, which is what I did in that video, but since I've never been able to find evidence to suggest it was meant to be feminist, I have to therefore assume that the theme I extracted was not put there on purpose, and this is little more than just a fan interpretation. Well, just because it's a fan interpretation doesn't mean it's wrong, does it? Not necessarily, but it depends on how you reach the conclusion. Are you basing it on what is there, or what you want to be there?
Let's go back to the Gorgo video one more time. I proposed an interpretation of it as feminist, but what did I base that on? Well, I looked at certain factors within the film itself. The cast is pretty much exclusively male, with the lone exception being the Mother Gorgo. It is noteworthy that we are ultimately meant to be on Mother Gorgo's side as she tears down London to rescue her baby from the people who kidnapped him. Furthermore, the world we see as controlled by men in the movie is decidedly exploitative, and Mother Gorgo tearing it down is framed as a form of divine retribution. Heck, Gorgo isn't even technically the proper name of either monster. It's a name forced onto them derived from the word gorgon, as in Medusa.
So I based the thesis on stuff that's in the movie, but again, my doubt remains that it was intentional. However, what if I said that Gorgo was an allegory for World War II?
Perhaps I could base it on the fact that Mother Gorgo destroys London, much like the Germans did during the Blitzkrieg, but I would have to end it there because nothing else lines up. The Gorgo species hails from Ireland, not Germany, and the mother's motivation has nothing to do with imperialism or anti-Semitism. Baby Gorgo is captured and placed in a pen, but not by Germans and not to be exterminated. The movie also has nothing to do with war beyond the military's confrontation with Mother Gorgo, but that's standard for the kaiju genre. If all I can cite for this hypothetical argument is the location of the climactic rampage, then I would be cherry-picking and not representing the source properly. It would be as inaccurate as claiming Godzilla 2014 is about World War II by saying the male Muto goes from Japan to Hawaii and ignoring every other detail. But who would be ignorant enough to say something like that?
So the primary difference is that in the Gorgo feminism video that does exist, I was extracting stuff from the movie to form my thesis. Whereas in the hypothetical Gorgo is World War II video I didn't make, I would have been reading stuff into the movie in order to make my thesis. See, reading things into the text is generally not something you should do. It's, in fact, usually done in a dishonest manner. Both people on the far left and the far right tried doing this with Godzilla x Kong, and as you're going to see, none of it holds up to scrutiny. So, if you're on the far left, you hate Donald Trump. That pretty much goes without saying, right? Hollywood also hates Trump, or at least they have ever since he decided to run on the Republican ticket, and they haven't been subtle about it either.
Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom has a random Trump allegory in it. You can tell from the character's hairstyle, the orange-hued skin, the way he speaks, and a little gag about him being chummy with a Russian, all the usual things people zero in on. Wonder Woman 1984 turned Maxwell Lord into a Trump allegory, what with him being a businessman who by the end is speaking in front of the presidential seal.
Those are but two examples of the many Trump allegories out there. Believe me, we've barely even scratched the surface, but there are only so many hours in the day, so let's move on.
Some people have posited that Skar King, the main villain of the new empire, is a Trump allegory, although this was before anyone had actually seen the movie.
Now that we have the movie in its entirety, is there anything in there that links Skar King to Trump?
Let's start with his appearance. Skar King is red. Right off the bat, that brings the theory into question because Trump allegories are traditionally orange. You might say that Skar King's shade of red is skewing towards orange, but the fact is that Zuko is closer to matching Trump's skin tone than Skar King, and Zuko is sympathetic.
Now, some people might argue that Skar King being red still counts him as a Trump allegory because red is the color of conservatism. Although, based on what I've come to understand, that's exclusively an American thing.
Elsewhere in the world, red is the color of liberalism as it represents the blood of revolutionaries, while blue is the conservative color due to its association with royalty. Indeed, communist and socialist nations tend to fly red flags, and red is even a term used to describe such regimes and those loyal to them. So if the color does mean anything, one could potentially interpret it to mean that the Red Skar King is a liberal revolutionary who rebelled against the royal blue Godzilla, and let's not forget that he's still framed as the bad guy.
So maybe the color doesn't mean anything at all beyond allowing him to stand out from the crowd. There's an old saying that sometimes the drapes are just blue, so maybe this time the monkey is just red. That would be my conclusion at this point, Snazzy. In fact, Skar King has no other physical similarities to Trump whatsoever.
Since throwing his hat into the political ring, Trump has been caricatured as having a barrel-shaped body, a round face, and comically small hands. Skar King, meanwhile, is very lanky and slim, with proportionally normal hands and a gaunt face. When the movie was in production, the media was also doing their level best to depict Trump as physically and mentally unwell, although that had to be abandoned eventually. Skar King, however, clearly has his wits about him and is undeniably active, so that doesn't line up with him being a Trump caricature either.
Now, getting away from the physical stuff, one could argue that Skar King embodies a lot of villainous traits, and a lot of villainous traits are also assigned to Trump by his detractors, so that's where the allegory comes into play. Skar King represents Trump not physically, but in his deeds. Yet I can't buy into that interpretation either, because Skar King is generically evil.
Let's really think about who he is for a moment. Skar King is a tyrant who rules through fear. He keeps his subjects oppressed and weak through slavery, favors only a few as his royal guard, and totally lacks empathy. Those are the kind of traits that have existed in fantasy villains since time immemorial. Had the movie been released at any other point in history, people would likely not have seen Skar King as a political satire, but as part of a storytelling lineage that includes the likes of Prince Mordred and Sauron. Heck, he has more in common with the Pharaoh from Exodus than he does with any modern politician. Anyway, to bring this back on point, the genericness of the evil means it is ultimately a surface-level trait, and thus is not a strong case for a political allegory.
And finally, let me pose this question.
Some people are convinced that Trump is a racist who will oppress black people across America. So if Skar King the Red Monkey really is meant to represent Trump, who do the brown monkeys he keeps as slaves represent?
You can't pick and choose when the allegory applies. Either it's all part of the allegory or none of it is. So, if the slave-driving red monkey represents Trump, what do the brown monkeys who are slaves represent? Alternatively, though, we could just accept that this was never the allegory in the first place, Skar King does not represent Trump, and we can move on to the next part. It wasn't just the Trump stuff, though. Godzilla's redesign was also a major talking point. Some of the concerns expressed were just the usual ones you'd expect when a character gets redesigned, but there were those who took it too far.
Alright, so it goes like this. The new design, officially named Godzilla Evolved, is noticeably slimmer than previous iterations, especially the monsterverse one that has been called that from the word go. In fact, Godzilla Evolved almost has what could be described as an hourglass figure. Even more prominent than that, however, are the huge pink spines that now run down his back, a stark contrast from the glowing blue he had before.
Once again, we find ourselves in the color theory side of interpretation.
Here we see that blue is predominantly a boy's color and pink is predominantly a girl's color. This led some commentators to claim that if Godzilla switched from blue to pink, that's allegorical of switching from male to female, and thus we are looking at a kaiju allegory for transgenderism, one of the biggest political topics of the modern day. Adding to this is how Godzilla even makes the switch, given how he barges into the Antarctic lair of Tiamat, a canonically female titan. Men entering women's spaces, you say, and being framed as a necessity? Could it be that the trans agenda has infiltrated the monsterverse? Sound the alarm, because Godzilla is now woke!
Well, it wasn't the first time that claim was made, only that time it came from the other side. Oh yeah, that. May as well do a quick reminder.
Over on TwitX a few years back, people landed on this shot from Godzilla vs. Kong and claimed that the color scheme matched the colors of the trans flag, meaning that Godzilla was being depicted as trans. This, however, was easily debunked simply by pointing out that this is the way Hong Kong looks at night, and Godzilla glowing blue has been a thing since the 60s, long before concepts of gender fluidity went mainstream. That means any resemblance between the colors in this shot and the colors associated with an ideology was a coincidence.
Yet that still leaves us with the conundrum of Godzilla Evolved. Is the redesign allegorical for what people claimed it was? Is it allegorical at all? Well, let's get down to brass tacks, shall we?
First and foremost, redesigns are par for the course when it comes to big franchise movies. After all, franchise movies have merchandise, and contrary to popular belief, consumers aren't stupid. If you repackage the same thing over and over claiming it's new when it's really recycled, people will figure it out. The better strategy is to make a new design, even if it's only subtly different, and sell that instead. Ergo, while Godzilla retains his look from the previous two movies for part of the runtime, he still gets a brand new look, which also means new toys for Playmates and Bandai to put on shelves. Toys that are bright and colorful sell better, so a bright and colorful Godzilla toy is a marketing win. It sounds shallow because it is shallow, but I don't make the rules.
As for the part about Godzilla entering Tiamat's lair being an anti-turf thing, I admit I kinda made that up myself because I haven't heard anyone else make the argument, and it just kind of occurred to me as I was writing the script. On the off chance somebody tries to run with it though, I can actually counter it by pointing out that Godzilla does not enter Tiamat's lair. Look again.
Godzilla is drilling through the ice up here, then the camera pans down to show Tiamat emerging from a totally different location. That is where Tiamat lives, not where Godzilla is trying to get into. Tiamat actually is in the wrong for impeding Godzilla. He's not even targeting her, but she chooses to get in his way. In fact, that's all she does. Her role has nothing to do with allegory. She is simply meant to be an obstacle that temporarily impedes Godzilla.
Very temporarily. I think the fight is barely longer than the sentence I'm saying right now. But that aside, we're still left with the color. Godzilla's new body type could still be described as masculine in its own way, but pink is pink, right? Yeah, it used to be a boy's color, but it's not anymore. Now it's a girl's color. So that must speak to the idea that Godzilla's being feminized or emasculated. Right?
Well, all one has to do is watch the movie to see that Godzilla's masculinity levels do not change after his evolution. In fact, Godzilla Evolved is every bit as fierce and brutal as in the previous movies. So why the pink spines? Well, it's partly a nod to the early days of the Millennium era when Godzilla's spines were tipped with magenta. It might also have been done to help contrast him against Shimo, who also glows blue.
The other major reason why Godzilla is colored pink in this movie is because director Adam Wingard likes the color pink. That's it. It was purely an aesthetic choice. Any sort of deeper meaning that could be assigned to it does not exist. By this point, I hope you understand why these interpretations of GXK are utterly ridiculous. They epitomize the idea of reading something into the art rather than extracting something from it. So does that mean GXK is completely void of meaning? Well, not necessarily. Having seen the movie plenty of times by now, I think I actually can extract some thematic meaning from it.
The most obvious theme is that of family, and the different paths that one can take in seeking it out. We have a parallel in both Gia and Kong starting out as the only remaining members of their respective kinds. Gia is the last Iwi, and Kong is the last great ape.
They both discover more of their kind in the Hollow Earth, and how they react to that discovery leads them in two very different directions, both of which are treated as equally legitimate.
In Gia's case, she is welcomed by the underground Iwis. Indeed, she's treated as the closest thing they have to royalty given the role she plays in the prophecy. Yet in the end, she chooses to stay with her adoptive mother Eileen Adler, because their bond is so strong that it transcends any cultural differences that exist between them. Kong, meanwhile, finds a tribe of apes that have nothing at all to do with him, and who don't initially welcome him as one of their own. Yet he chooses to stay with them because he knows that they need a benevolent ruler to take the place of Skar King.
We even see hints of this familial theme with Godzilla and Mothra.
These two are totally different species, yet their bond is so strong that it transcends everything that separates them. Skar King, meanwhile, has no significant bonds other than those whom he employs or enslaves. He is solitary, and in the end, that is his undoing.
Then, of course, there's a theme about masculinity, represented by the trifecta of Kong, Skar King, and Zuko.
Skar King can be seen as representing toxic masculinity, since he embodies all sorts of negative masculine traits. He's a tyrant who rules through violence and fear, subjugating most of his people while favoring a select few. He's a warmonger who lives only to conquer and kill, purely to increase the power he already wields. He holds a grudge, literally for centuries. He mocks rivals for superficial reasons.
And as far as how he treats women and children, yikes.
What appears to be his personal harem cowers in fear of him. Zuko dares not cross him to his face, and Shimo is chained up and controlled through pain. The only positive thing that can be said about Skar King is that he at least fights his own battles rather than hiding behind his guards, but that's undermined by the fact that he's the instigator every time, which reinforces the negative warmongering aspect.
Now contrast all of that with Kong, who represents true masculinity.
Kong is a protector and a provider. He does not kill unless it's necessary for him to do so. He does not pick fights, but he will not hold back when dragged into one. He lets old grudges go for the sake of the world. He cares very much for Gia, and for Zuko after a time.
Speaking of the little guy, Zuko is caught between the two.
Zuko grew up knowing only the evil of Skar King, and that's what he defaults to when meeting Kong. Indeed, he tries multiple times to ditch the Eighth Wonder or lead him to his death, failing every time, but to his surprise, Kong forgives him. Gradually, Zuko realizes that there is another way to be, a better way that gets better results. Kong is the positive masculine role model that Zuko needs, and we see the little guy change as a result.
Even Godzilla represents more positive masculinity than you might at first think. Yes, his only two confirmed Titan kills in the movie are both female, Scylla and Tiamat respectively, but you have to look at the context.
Godzilla kills Scylla because Scylla was attacking Rome, and as a protector of the natural balance, he had to put an end to it. Regarding Tiamat, as mentioned, she chose to come out and try to kill him, which would have impeded his role in saving the world, so she had to be dealt with too. These two cross the line that Godzilla holds, and they pay the price.
You may notice, however, that Godzilla does not try to kill Shimo.
The whole while, especially in Rio, he is preventing her from attacking Kong until the crystal is destroyed, after which Godzilla lets Shimo kill her former oppressor. Even though his actions throughout the movie are specifically designed for him to confront Shimo, it's clear that he never intended to kill her. Perhaps freeing her was always part of the plan.
What about the fact that Godzilla attacks Kong in Egypt?
Again, context is what matters.
Although humanity is concerned that Godzilla will attack Kong if the latter ever returns to the surface, we must note that the king doesn't bother with the Eighth Wonder when the latter shows up for dental work. This demonstrates that Godzilla really isn't concerned with Kong anymore. He only pays attention when Kong turns up in Egypt and roars what sounds like a challenge.
As established, Godzilla goes where the balance is being upset. Kong showing up on some random island in the middle of nowhere is no big deal. But now he's in a populated area and he's roaring out what sounds like a challenge. As far as Godzilla knows, Kong is just getting in the way again, so naturally he's going to attack.
Yet also consider that when Mothra and Gia show up to explain things, Godzilla's tune instantly changes. He may not be fond of Kong, but if the monkey is here to help, he won't reject it either. Ergo, while Godzilla is not quite as empathetic as Kong, he's not a senseless brute either.
Now, having laid all of that out, some of you might think I'm contradicting my initial thesis, but I would like to remind you that earlier I also pointed out that just because something is thematic doesn't mean it's political. And in fact, themes of masculinity are not political either.
People have done their level best to make them political, but in point of fact, they are matters of ethics and morality, concepts that can exist without any connection to a government system. Frankly, if you think that ethics and morality have anything to do with politics, then you really haven't been paying attention.
But these themes exist as subtext in GXK, something that exists beneath the surface to bolster the story. They might not even be the point of the story, which ironically is the point of this video.
You know, I'm not entirely sure, but I seem to recall there is political talk in GXK of some sort. I got it. What about the subplot where governments are trying to get into the Hollow Earth?
Oh yeah, I nearly forgot about that myself. Having been reminded of it though, I think I can address it.
In case you also forgot, it's mentioned towards the beginning of the movie that Monarch is butting heads with the government to prevent it from accessing the Hollow Earth, despite Monarch being a government-funded organization, but whatever. Later on, while Bernie is filming the subterranean iwi village for his website, Trapper tries talking him out of posting it by bringing up some familiar talking points. He says that this civilization and environment are unspoiled, and making them public knowledge would disrupt that purity. He even asks Bernie to consider how many primitive civilizations have perished when advanced civilizations found them.
It sure sounds political, but is it really?
First off, Trapper's argument for Bernie to keep the footage to himself relies on him begging the question. Despite the phrasing, he's clearly leading Bernie to the idea that what he says is inevitable. Furthermore, he's implying another absolutism. He believes that his outlook is at best the most probable outcome and at worst the only outcome.
Now yes, there are many examples from throughout history where two cultures have met and one subjugated the other. However, there are also many examples throughout history of two cultures meeting and mutually benefiting from the contact. It's hard to say if the iwi would suffer from contact with the modern world, but we do know that iwi have suffered from a lack of contact.
Let's not forget that the iwi of Skull Island were wiped out by a storm, with Gia being the only survivor. Details on what went down are still sparse, but GXK pretty much strikes down the notion that Monarch evacuated the iwi as depicted in Kingdom Kong. Would that have happened if there was more of a modern presence on the island? Who can say?
Delving a bit deeper, I'll beg my own question and ask, who said Trapper was talking exclusively about governments? If we're taking his statement as a solid inevitable fact, then potentially anyone can fulfill Trapper's prophecy.
GXK's prequel comic features a human villain in the form of a poacher with no political ties, just an insatiable thirst for vengeance. As shown before, prequel comics aren't necessarily hard canon, but it can still be used as a hypothetical example that this is not exclusively a political issue. This means we're discussing a generally ethical conundrum, not a specifically political one. I suppose it's also worth noting that Trapper never considers the possibility that he or any of the other survivors might have brought a disease to the city that the iwi have no immunity against, so we probably shouldn't be taking his words too seriously anyway.
Finally, and perhaps most importantly, this particular subplot doesn't actually go anywhere.
The topic of governmental intrusion into the Hollow Earth is only discussed in brief towards the beginning of the movie, and then it's left behind. Trapper's discussion with Bernie very quickly shifts from the ethical question of culture clash to a personal assessment of Bernie as a character, so even that isn't focused on too much.
Heck, I very nearly forgot that this part was in the movie, and I bet a lot of you did too, which should tell you how important it is to the proceedings. It's lip service, nothing more. I hope it's clear by now that Godzilla Kong the New Empire is not a political movie. The things people were expecting to find in there were absent, and what is there isn't really that important. That's because the movie's raison d'etre is escapism.
Right from the beginning, that sweeping shot of the camera flying through the Hollow Earth is underscored by an arrangement of Welcome to My World, fading out right as the singer croons, Leave Your Cares Behind.
That right there is the movie using an American standard to let you know that what you're in for is just meant to be a fun ride.
Whatever was bothering you before, you don't have to worry about it during the hour and a half you spend watching this movie. Just kick back, relax, and watch the monsters brawl.
And you know what? After years of movies, shows, games, and all other kinds of media pushing agendas and having the artist be in our faces about what they want us to believe, a movie like Godzilla x Kong was exactly what the world needed at exactly the right time.
Before anyone calls me out, I am not saying that art should avoid discussing topical issues or asking difficult questions. Remember, I also happen to like Godzilla -1, and I would even say that GMO is an overall superior film to GXK if pressed, so don't get to thinking that I'm a mindless consumer who only wants bright colors and loud noises to amuse me.
I am prepared to ponder the difficult questions in life, but my question is, why should I have to do that every second of every day?
Ask yourself this. If a person working all day at a difficult job takes a break, does that mean he's lazy? Of course not. It means he's tired and needs to recover before he burns out. Now, using that same line of thinking, if a person inundated with political rhetoric from every possible source sits down to play a mindless game or watch a mindless movie, does that mean he's an intellectual coward? I would say no. It means that he too just needs a break.
Providing that break is exactly the reason why escapism exists, and its values should never be dismissed or downplayed.
I don't know if any of you noticed, but people who live exclusively in the political realm tend to be miserable and unpleasant. They don't allow themselves a break because they don't believe it's possible to even take one, so they just sink into the mire of agendas and policies and don't allow themselves to ever have fun. Something I find pitiable, but it also makes me wonder if that's part of the reason some critics were so harsh towards GXK.
Again, don't misunderstand me. I'm not claiming that GXK is perfect or beyond reproach. However, I also know that when people who believe all art is political encounter anything to the contrary, they tend to react harsher than normal to it. At the same time, fans of GXK have been known to respond strongly to criticism of the movie, which I think mostly comes from the fact that they don't care if it's flawed, they're having fun, and don't want anyone raining on their parade. Obviously, neither side should be getting up in arms over something like GXK because it exists to be lighthearted fun. Remember fun? Doesn't anyone remember laughter?
That fun resonated with people, and for good reason. Godzilla Kong: The New Empire is a cartoon, and as I've said before, sometimes people just want to watch a cartoon. There's nothing wrong with wanting to, so go ahead, enjoy the escapism. It's there for a reason. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni viewer signing off. And this is just a friendly reminder that I like both Godzilla Kong: The New Empire and Godzilla -1, because there's no rule saying you have to like only one or the other. I bet there are some people who just won't be able to comprehend that.